Good evening. Welcome to People's University, the Struggle for Women's Rights. I will introduce our guests for the evening in just a minute. I have a couple of announcements before we do that. First of all, this Tuesday at Lunch with Books at noon, Tina Fagan, who is a classical pianist from Pittsburgh, plays with the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra. We'll be doing a solo piano recital of various tunes, which are on our website. And the next Thursday, Anne-Marie LaFossa will be back she was our instructor in week 1 to talk about the Equal Rights Amendment, which has persisted all these years and is still a topic. So we'll cover that next Thursday at 6:30. This evening, you will be able to win if you ask relevant questions of our guests. 2 passes. Free passes to the Heinz History Center, which Jeanne pointed out you can also use at the Rock Shelter or at Fort Pitt Museum. And you will have a chance to win this bag, Votes for Women. Very nice. So I encourage you to ask a question and get your name in the drawing toward the end. You can ask a question anytime. We'll go back to them when we get to that point. Okay. Judi Hendrickson and Jeanne Finstein are local history researchers who enjoy discovering and sharing interesting pieces of the past, particularly Wheeling's history. They are the authors of a book on local history, Walking Pleasant Valley, and are longtime active members of the historic preservation organization, Friends of Wheeling. Their topic this evening is Suffragists of Wheeling. Here are Judi and Jeanne.
Hi, good evening.
Good evening.
First, we'd like to thank Sean, of course, for organizing this and the Ohio County Public Library. It's great to be able to virtually interact with people during the COVID shutdown. So, as Sean said, we're going to talk about the suffrage fight that occurred with primarily a focus on what happened in Wheeling. This is just sort of a timeline of the suffrage movement in general, a very compressed one. Earlier speakers talked about some of the early movements throughout the country. And last week, we even heard about some of the famous women from the early years of our country. As you'll see on the timeline, of course, as a reminder, 1848 was when the Seneca Falls Convention was held. And that, of course, is seen as kind of the beginning of the concerted effort for women's suffrage. This was before West Virginia became a state, and it was before the 15th Amendment was ratified, which allowed African-American men to vote. But of course, in many cases, they were not allowed, even though technically they were permitted to vote. In 1878, women's suffrage was first introduced to the U.S. Congress, but of course, as we all know, it was not successful at that level. And then down through what we will be talking about today, beginning in 1895, which was when the first organized group was here in Wheeling, the Political Equity League. And then we'll go on down through until the 19th Amendment was finally ratified.
Many laws and social attitudes meant women faced barriers and prejudice throughout history, in work and in education, also in marriage. And here are a few examples of the discrimination that women faced in 1918. Women couldn't elect those who governed. If single or divorced, they couldn't establish credit in their own names or have control over her children or property. They could not serve on a jury or even request a trial by jury. They could not dispute a husband's claim that she was insane and should be committed to a mental institution. They could not attend many universities or medical schools, and they could be committed to a mental institution. They could not attend many universities. They would not have a voice in labor laws and would restrict working conditions endured by faculty workers. They were barred from attending the dedication of the Statue of Liberty, the national symbol of our freedom, and they could be refused service for spending their own money in a pub.
Not like we have it now, is it, Judi?
No.
No, I can't imagine. I can understand why they were ready to revolt.
That's right.
This is the logo or the letterhead of the West Virginia Equal Suffrage Association from about 1913. By that point, the map is indicative of the states where women's suffrage was already approved. And you'll see, according to the legend, that the states in the western part of the country were the ones that introduced women's suffrage first. This happened quite frequently as states were admitted to the Union. But West Virginia is one of those in the dark color, indicating that they did not have women's suffrage. You'll also notice the names of people at that point, the women who were involved with the suffrage movement around the state, and we'll be talking about several of those this evening. Of course, the one most well-known for Wheeling suffrage movement was Dr. Harriet Jones. Hattie was born in Pennsylvania, but as a young child, her family moved to the Terra Alta area of West Virginia. Her father was a Welsh immigrant, but he was politically involved and actually was a member of the state legislature for 3 terms. When she was 12 years old, the family recognized that the educational opportunities in the more rural part of the state where they lived were just not good enough for Hattie. And so she was shipped off to Wheeling to go to the Wheeling Female College. She graduated from that and then also graduated from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania with honors in 1884. Following that, she had quite a successful career as a medical doctor. She became the first female doctor ever licensed in the state of West Virginia. And in 1888, she was named the assistant superintendent by the board of the West Virginia Hospital for the Insane, located in Weston. Now, Judi mentioned that at this time, a woman could be admitted to the Weston State Hospital, sent there by her husband for reasons that today would seem ludicrous, and the woman would have no recourse but to have to stay there. In 1892, she came to Wheeling and she opened the Wheeling Women's Hospital. On the left, you'll see a postcard that shows that hospital. It's on 15th Street. And on the right is a current photograph. That building still stands and is owned by the Homeless Coalition of Wheeling. Now, Hattie was someone who just had her finger in all kinds of things, and I particularly like this picture of her. You can see her at a desk with lots of papers around. Looks kind of like our desk,
yes,
doesn't
it does.
Judi?
Yes, it does.
With lots of work, and she's typing away on an old-fashioned typewriter. Now, in addition to her suffrage work, she was very involved in other areas as well. In particular, the tuberculosis movement, or anti-tuberculosis. There, she was very influential in founding the State Tuberculosis Sanitarium in Terra Alta, West Virginia, and later a separate hospital for colored people who had tuberculosis. She traveled around the entire state promoting health and, in particular, tuberculosis. And it's said that she visited every county in the state. Now, she and her assistant would drive around in a Ford car that they had at the time. And it said that they would have to crank the car by hand. There were no filling stations, so they had to fix their own tires. They had to carry with them their gasoline and oil in cans that they would refill in the country stores, and travel on virtually unpaved roads in much of the state. In 1912, the state legislature appropriated $9,900 for an educational campaign on tuberculosis. And the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad even supplied a railroad car that could be reconditioned and equipped with an exhibit so that she could better relay the problems of tuberculosis to the people throughout the state. So quite interesting effort on her part on tuberculosis. She also was influential in establishing a children's home in Elkins and also a home for wayward girls, if you will. And of course, as most women of the time, she was involved with the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She went on to become the first woman to serve in the West Virginia House of Delegates once she was able to. And she is remembered with a highway marker in Glendale, where she lived toward the end of her life. And I found also that she wrote a booklet that's called Facts. As you can see, facts that every intelligent voter should know about the government of West Virginia. Now, I printed a copy of that and leafed through it, and I think this would be a valuable resource even today. It talks about different departments in the government. It talks about how a law is made, how representatives are elected, which state officials are appointed and which ones are elected and what their duties are. Very, very influential, very informative booklet. So you can go online, I'm sure, and find this if you're interested. Now, another woman who was involved in the early years was Fanny Wheat. Fanny Wheat was the wife of George K. Wheat, who was a local notions merchant and then later was also involved on the boards of Wheeling Pottery and Wheeling Steam and Iron. As you can see from her birth date, 1838, by 1895, when the work first began, she was 56 years old already at that point. So she was a little bit older than some of the other participants in the suffrage movement. Excuse me. She had 7 children. She and her husband had 7 children, and she now rests in Greenwood Cemetery, and there's her grave marker. One of the sad things about Fanny Wheat was an affair that her husband had that became well known. It seems that one evening, Archibald Campbell, who was the editor of the Wheeling Intelligencer at the time, was scheduled to go out of town, missed a train, so went back to the Intelligencer office and worked until the early hours of the morning and then started to make his way home. As he approached his home, a man came running out of the house carrying his clothes, and of course, this caused a huge scandal. Archibald Campbell chased after him, didn't beat him up, but just wanted to find out who he was, and lo and behold, he was George K. Wheat. Campbell then went to the McClure, spent the night there, and then the next morning filed for divorce. I can't imagine how upsetting this would have been for Fanny Wheat. The one good thing was that the report of this affair didn't make the Wheeling newspaper, but because of the prominence of the men involved, it was in the New York Times, and that's something that can be found. This is Anna Parker Hall. Her first name was actually Margaret, but she always went by Anna. She was just 14 years old when the Civil War broke out, yet she volunteered to be a nurse and worked under the famous Wheeling nurse Lydia Holliday, known as Mother Holliday, first in the old Sprigg House that served as a hospital during the Civil War, and then later in the hospital, the military hospital in Grafton. After the war, she married a Union veteran. They settled in Wheeling, and she was another woman who was just involved in a variety of different things. For example, she organized the local chapter of the Eastern Star. She was active in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and was one of the founders of what was called the Loyal Ladies League, which was established as an auxiliary to the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic. The Loyal Ladies League name eventually was changed to the Ladies of the Grand Army of the Republic. This was an organization that assisted veterans of the Civil War and also their families when they were in need. And Anna served as the national president of this organization in 1903. That organization apparently still exists and promotes patriotism and loyalty and that sort of thing. But she was very involved with the suffrage movement in addition to all of those other activities. Now, we'll talk a little bit later about a newspaper supplement in 1916. It was an 8-page supplement to the Wheeling Intelligencer, and within that, Florence Hoag wrote an extensive history of the suffrage movement in Wheeling. Unfortunately, the newspaper articles from that time, being now online and digitized, have pictures of the women who were involved that don't duplicate very well. So we sort of get a feel for what Florence looked like from this picture. Florence and her maiden sister, neither married, lived at 9 Hamilton Avenue. Toward the end of her life, Florence actually moved to Clearwater, Florida, and that's where she passed away, although she is buried in Greenwood. Of interest with her, I found it to be interesting that her father was a brother of Frances Hoag. And if some of you have followed some of the Civil War series presentations, you may remember that Frances Hoag, or Frank Hoag, was a Civil War veteran on the Confederate side. He was in the Confederate Navy and had a very stellar career in the Navy for the Confederate side. Afterwards, he ended up in Wheeling as the city engineer and was the engineer who was responsible for building the Main Street Bridge, which is the stone arch bridge that still stands on Main Street right next to the Borey Lofts. So Francis Hoag was Florence's uncle.
We find so many people in Greenwood Cemetery that we didn't know were buried there.
Yes.
Another tour.
Absolutely.
Suffragists.
There you go. There you go. Although I will say that Hattie is buried in Terra Alta, probably with her family.
Well, we'll have to move her.
I guess so.
We're going to talk about Henrietta Folks. Henrietta Romaine Folks was born on July the 4th, 1890. And she was born in Wheeling, West Virginia, to Harry J. and Caroline Knobloch Arbenz. And they were accomplished musicians from Germany. Her mother had been an opera star in Europe. Henrietta was also a very accomplished musician. And at the age of 18, she was appointed the head of the music department at West Liberty. With Mrs. Gibson Caldwell, Mrs. Folks was one of the citizens who were instrumental in establishing Wheeling's Symphony Orchestra and was an early supporter of the orchestra's Music Under the Stars at Ogilvy Park. It was in August of 1910 that Henrietta married Edward Romaine, a real estate investor, an investment broker in other ways. In 1937, after his death, she married George Folks, who was a bank manager from New York. Now, Henrietta was a very active participant in the West Virginia suffrage movement. Folks began her career in 1915 by selling suffragettes newspapers in Wheeling and distributing informational pamphlets at local steel mills. And she also acted as a host and escort to suffrage speakers who were visiting Wheeling. She served as the congressional chairman for the West Virginia Equal Suffrage Association, and it was under this title that she attended the 65th and 66th United States congressional sessions. She served as a finance chairman for the West Virginia Equal Suffrage Association's ratification committee during the state's ratification process in the 19th Amendment. Folks and other members of the West Virginia Equal Suffrage Association were members who really, really worked to make sure that the ratification went through. In an interview conducted for the Upper Ohio Valley Historical Review, Folks describes her strategy for soliciting support from members of the legislature. And I'm reading, quote, what she said. I had a list of men, legislators, I was supposed to take care of. I had to know where they were at all times and make sure they were in their seats when the vote was called. I remember one legislator was walking to meet his train with his suitcase in his hand when I told him how important it was for his vote to be done. He turned and walked back to the hotel. She also stated, I took a long taxi ride to the home of another legislator, a carpenter by trade. He was working at the top of some scaffolding. I had to climb a ladder to talk with him. I begged him to return to his seat. You know, he did. And that's some of the things we had to do to get the amendment ratified. She was very brave to do that. For her work as finance chairman, Folks was presented with a Distinguished Service Certificate by Carrie Chapman Catt, who was a very, very active reformist, in 1920. After the ratification of the 19th Amendment, Folks remained very politically active. She was a charter member of the West Virginia League of Women Voters. It was organized in Huntington, West Virginia in, I believe, October 1920. At the organization's first convention, Folks was elected as the legislative chairman. In 1922, she was unanimously elected as the league's second president. And at the time of her election, she was the youngest state president in the country. During her presidential term, Folks formed the Joint Legislative Council, which worked to ensure legislative programs within the state organizations. She was elected to a second term as president, but had to relinquish her role due to poor health. Henrietta died in 1985 and is buried at Greenwood Cemetery in Wheeling. Active lady.
Yes, indeed. So many of them were. It's amazing. I don't know how they had time to raise families and do all the things that they did.
Just like you, Jeanne.
Wow, and you. And I apologize in advance. This is another example of the best image we could find of what this lady looked like. Again, from a newspaper article. It's sad that we weren't able to find any better pictures.
That's what I wish I looked like on Zoom. Annie Caldwell Boyd. Annie Caldwell Boyd was born in Wheeling on October 29th, 1842. And she was the daughter of Alfred and Martha Caldwell. Her father was a member of the Virginia State and Republican Party. And he served as mayor of Wheeling. I had to look that up. I wasn't familiar with his name being as mayor of Wheeling. And that was from January 1850 to 1852. Annie married George Edmund Boyd in 1853, and the couple had 3 children who were all very successful. Annie was very active in the women's suffrage cause from its organizational beginning in 1895, holding office in the state association as well as with Wheeling groups. Sadly, though, she didn't live to see women obtain the right to vote. She died in Wheeling on February the 9th, 1918.
Now, as I said, most of our talk is about what happened in Wheeling and with Wheeling participants, but I just had to mention this particular woman, even though she was not a Wheeling native, because she was so influential in the state, and that's Lena Lo Yost. She was born in Marion County. She spent some time in Morgantown, also in Clarksburg, and in other places following her husband's law career. She was involved, of course, in a variety of things, such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and she supported her efforts to ban the sale of alcohol when her husband, Ellis Yost, was a member of the House of Delegates. He was the one who proposed the 1913 enforcement of prohibition in West Virginia, and that law became known by his name, the Yost Law. And I read somewhere that she was so involved that a lot of people thought that the law was actually named for her rather than for her husband because she was so active. But she did a variety of other things. In fact, she chaired the National Convention, the Republican National Convention that nominated Warren G. Harding for president.
My gosh.
Is that amazing?
Wow.
She then was appointed by Harding to represent the United States at an international conference on alcoholism. But some other little interesting trivia about her: she became a member of the State Board of Education and served as the first woman in that role. She was a driving force behind the construction of Elizabeth Moore Hall, E. Moore Hall at WVU, which many of us know as our phys ed classes if we went to WVU. She also used her national influence to put the first federal penitentiary for women in Alderson, West Virginia, which is still in use today. She became, when her husband moved to Washington for work, she became the director of the women's division of the National Republican Party. And she lived to the ripe old age of 94. And several of these women had long lives.
They did.
I guess they were busy, too busy to die.
I said, if I ever stop, I'll die.
There you go. There you go.
Like a hummingbird, they
Right.
say.
Now, earlier I mentioned something about a particular issue of the Wheeling Intelligencer, which was published on May the 1st of 1916. And this picture appeared in the newspaper the next day, showing the women who were out selling this special edition of the newspaper. And this is the same picture, I believe, that Sean used to advertise our talk. This was a year when there was a concerted effort to finally get things through the legislature, the West Virginia legislature. A year before, the suffragists had pressured the West Virginia legislature to such an extent that they put a referendum for the state voters to authorize. The year before, it was suggested that the state's constitution be amended to read, "The citizens of the state, both male and female, shall be entitled to vote at all elections held within the counties in which they respectively reside." Well, needless to say, that didn't pass the year before. There had been prior efforts. For example, in 1913, there was a huge women's suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. that was attended by some of the members of the Wheeling group. In 1908, there had been an amendment that had been supported by the State Bar Association, allowing women to serve on boards of state institutions as county clerks, probation officers, and notaries public. But that was also defeated. So over the years, things were building. Efforts were made for a variety of different legislation, and it just never happened. So 1916, as I mentioned, May the 1st, was a special issue of the Wheeling Intelligencer. 8 full pages were devoted to the women's suffrage effort. Officers at the time included some of the women we've heard about, Dr. Harriet Jones, Florence Hogue, and others. In this particular newspaper, the articles included the history of the movement in the state, as I mentioned before, that Florence Hogue had written, but also articles written by prominent people other than women, prominent men in the city, one of whom was the local rabbi, Rabbi Silver. Now, this rabbi was only in Wheeling for 2 years. You can see from his statement here that he compared women's suffrage to democracy, and I'll let you read through that. Rabbi Silver had married a Wheeling girl, one of the Horkheimer daughters. He later moved to Cleveland and became the rabbi of the Temple of Cleveland, and became known as a spokesman for the Jewish community in the United States on the establishment of the State of Israel. So very influential in a variety of different ways. His full article is printed in that special section of the newspaper. Another article was written by Reverend Strider. Reverend Strider was the rector of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church at the time. He's a member of the Wheeling Hall of Fame. And he, as you see, talks about the double standard that exists. And of course noted that the vote is woman's moral and social right, and she should be allowed to exercise it. The paper also included a poem. Unfortunately, we don't know who wrote it. The byline just says, "By a Wheeling woman." But I can see us marching along, equal suffrage on to glory, for the conflict is before ye, victory is hovering o'er ye, leading to the fight. Rah, rah. And so forth. I don't know if they used this march at all, but it did appear printed in the newspaper. Now, interestingly, this special section also included advertisements that appeared to be in support of women's suffrage. We have on the left the Oyster and Fish Depot of C.N. Taylor. To have a vote will help every woman in business.
Good.
Okay, that's good. Hair plumbing, which existed for many years after this, until fairly recently, actually. We have always believed in votes for women, which is good. And then the Alexander store that sold shoes. Apparently, every woman who knows enough to vote should know the importance of correct fitting of shoes.
Very important.
Very important. There were other ads that were just generic, but these were the three that I found in that 8-page section that supported women's suffrage. Now, of course, everybody didn't support women's suffrage.
Oh, no, no. Mrs. Hearn did not support suffrage. Opposing votes for women may seem surprising today, but anti-suffrage views dominated among men and women through the early 20th century. And suffragists had national organizations since 1869, but anti-suffragists, or suffragists, try to say that, did not found their own group until 1911. Well, just like men and women supported votes for women, men and women organized against suffrage as well. Anti-suffragists argued that most women did not want to vote. Because they took care of the home and children, they said women didn't have time to vote or stay updated on politics. Some argued women lacked the expertise or mental capacity to offer a useful opinion about political issues. Others asserted that women's votes would simply double the electorate, voting would cost more without adding any value. Now, Roland Hunt said, there are obvious disadvantages about having women in the House or Senate. I do not know what is going to be done about their hats, how a poor little man to get on with a couple of women wearing enormous hats in front of him. Well, now, Senator Charles Hobson said, first of all, women have fathers, husbands, and brothers, so why do they need to vote? We men can look after the complicated stuff. If they got the vote, what next? They'll want to be politicians, lawyers, and could you imagine that? You also have the fact that there are no women bankers or merchants. So what have they contributed to society? Babies, and that's it. They can keep a house clean, but some of them show a very poor performance with that simple task. That would be me. Women are tremendously accessible, extraordinarily impressible, noted for the adoption of any new thing and for the easy acceptance of other people's views. Are those qualities which fit women to rule over the home and foreign affairs of a mighty government? Now, another one said the ideal woman is subordinate and pleasing to men, obedient, humble, modest, pure, delicate, refined, gentle, soft, charming, beautiful. These qualities would be out of place in the boisterous world of politics, and good women would only be made rough and coarse. Women in politics would be open to corruption and bribery. Most women do not really want the vote themselves, and only a minority of bitter, unattractive, frustrated women bother about it. Women would be corrupt by politics, and chivalry will die out. If a woman became involved in politics, they would stop marrying, having children, and the human race would die out. Women are emotional creatures and incapable of making a sound political decision. Now, the mental exertion of voting would cause infertility in women. My daughter-in-law should read that. Because bad women will corrupt politics and bad politics will corrupt women. Now, finally, suffragists said men shouldn't vote because men are too emotional to vote. Their conduct at baseball games and political conventions show this, while their innate tendency to appeal to force renders them particularly unfit for the task of government.
My goodness, my goodness.
I know.
Now, I went through those few years, particularly around the 1916 time when there was the big effort here in Wheeling, to see what I could find in the way of anti-suffrage efforts or articles. And there was very little. It seemed that a few outside agitators, does that sound familiar, came to Wheeling and spoke against suffrage, but it didn't seem to catch on. Now, as Judi alluded to just a minute ago, Lydia Cromwell Hearn, who was a very influential woman at the time, was supposedly anti-suffrage, but we couldn't seem to find anything in particular about her. And any of the articles that talked about anti-suffrage in Wheeling did not include the names of anyone.
No.
I did find an interesting quote, though, from one of the national organizers, whose name was Eleanor Rowell of Atlanta, Georgia. She had spent some time in the Northern Panhandle and wrote about Wheeling. I really think suffrage is very difficult up in this part of the state. It was certainly started wrong in Wheeling. I mean, the fashionable rich people did not take it up, and the people who did had too much of the reformer spirit to make much of a go of it. That certainly has had its effect throughout the whole section. Now, I found this particularly interesting because the names of the women who we found were the rich, fashionable ones.
Yes, they
we
were.
found the names of Lachlan and Ott and Hazlitt and Burt. And when that particular supplement to the newspaper came out, they included the names and quotes from various supporters around the state, including the current governor of the state, 4 former governors of West Virginia, one of West Virginia's U.S. senators, the state commissioner of agriculture, the state highway commissioner, and there were endorsements from the West Virginia Federation of Labor, the West Virginia Federation of Women's Clubs, the West Virginia Sunday School Association, and of course the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So I'm not sure how this outside agitator got her information about that it was just the non-rich and the non-influential who were involved, and that was why it failed. But I thought that was sort of interesting. And yes, women's suffrage will destroy the home, and society will lose its common sense and decency and go back to barbarism.
Darn Hate when that happens.
It is indeed. So then what happened? The 1916 effort also failed, and things seemed to languish for a while. But World War I came along and brought many changes to society in general. Women had to go to work to support their families and to man the factories while their husbands were away at battle. Other events occurred in the interim. The Prohibition Amendment, the 18th Amendment, was passed, for example. We mentioned that before. The 19th Amendment is the one that we, of course, were trying to get passed during that time period. And so a Wheeling man was quite influential and quite important in the passage of that. And Judi will talk about him next.
Yes, Jess Block. We actually talked about Jess Block at a cemetery tour. Jess Block was born in Wheeling. His parents were Samuel and Bertha Prager Block. He was educated at Lindsley Institute, Phipps Exeter Academy, and Worcester, I can't say it, Polytechnic Institute. And he also graduated from another college. And he joined his father's business, Block Brothers Tobacco Company, and became president. He also represented the people of Ohio County by serving in both the West Virginia House of Delegates and the state Senate. Block was serving in the Senate in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was up for vote. The federal amendment for women's suffrage passed U.S. Congress in 1919. For an amendment to be ratified, it had to pass by 3/4 vote in all individual state legislatures. Many states immediately ratified the amendment, but others, like West Virginia, were not scheduled for a regular session until after the 1920 elections. Well, Governor Cornwall didn't want to call a special session of the legislature, as the cost was going to be around $1,500 a day. But a special session was needed on a tax issue, and Cromwell felt that he could introduce the vote on ratification at the same time to save money. Now, the special session was called for February the 27th, 1920. Telegrams from all over the state began pouring in favor of giving women the vote. Just as it appeared that ratification was a sure thing, the anti-suffragists imported a large number of lobbyists to Charleston to change the mind of legislators about the vote. The House of Delegates quickly ratified the amendment, 47-40, to pass it, but the Senate deadlocked by a 14-14 vote. In a dramatic effort to end the stalemate, the governor and the Senate president called Senator Block. When he received the messages, he was taking a swim in California because he and his wife were out there on vacation. He immediately got out of the pool and they gathered their things and left. As he said, if it's going to benefit men, women, and society, then I am for it. This is the 100th anniversary, and that's a tremendous achievement. He chartered a plane to get him as far as St. Louis, where he caught a train, arriving in Charleston the second morning after leaving California. That's pretty fast. At 2:25 a.m. on March the 10th, he met the suffragists waiting at the station. He carried golf clubs and a thermos of coffee. Suffragist leaders escorted him from the station to the Kanawha Hotel, where he chatted with friends and went to bed. Around 1:30 p.m., the crowd began to fill the galleries above the Senate chamber the next day. In half an hour, the galleries were full of women dressed in their finest. Society women of the state were out in mass. The throng was so large that every vantage point was occupied. Men stood on radiators and on windowsills to see. Children, especially girls, filled every other available space. At 2 p.m., Block entered wearing a dark, fashionably cut, double-breasted suit and tortoiseshell glasses. He smoked an unknown brand of cigarette, cigarette, through an amber cigarette holder. The crowd burst into applause. Thanks to the newspaper, we know all this. With the vote, the tie was broken, and West Virginia became the 34th state to ratify the 19th Amendment. 36 were needed.
Amazing.
It is amazing, isn't it?
Amazing. Yes. So this is something that would make a good movie, I think.
I think it would too.
Okay.
All
right. So now the 19th Amendment has been passed and women have the right to vote. But was it really accepted, do you think?
Well, Irene Breaux was the first woman to vote in Cabell County, and she frequently recalled her experiences on Election Day of 1920. She said she voted with her husband at the Kessler Garage, an old garage at the back of the Kessler Hatfield Hospital. They voted in horrible places, she said, saloons and garages, stables, and places where they said it was unfit for women to vote. She continued, when I walked in, the men giggled and giggled and grinned, and some of them didn't even know I was allowed to come. She said a paper ballot was given to her, and you were supposed to mark it who you were voting for, and then you were to fold it and were supposed to put it in the box. Well, on the way to the box, there were about a half a dozen men who said, Ms. Breaux, thank you. I'll put your vote in the box for you. Can I help you? Oh, no, she said. We'd been warned if we took the vote out of her hands, then it would become illegal and they'd have to throw it away. So she went up and she put her vote in the box. And that was the scheme that some of the men used to get the votes thrown out.
Wow. I love this picture. I don't think this is the particular lady you're talking about, but it sort of gives an idea of the men's reaction to having a woman vote.
Look at the man.
Oh, yeah.
He's like, oh, she got away with it.
Yeah. Okay, so here we are back to our timeline again. As we noted, the initial efforts countrywide began back in 1848. It wasn't until almost 50 years later that the efforts were begun in earnest in Wheeling. That would be in 1895. And it wasn't until 1920 that the 19th Amendment, was ratified by West Virginia and then the U.S. As Judi said, West Virginia was the 34th state out of 36 that were needed for the ratification. So here we are. We have fought the long fight.
Yes.
We can now vote. And I think we should all honor the work done by these brave women and be sure to vote. Your vote counts. It's important that we vote.
It certainly is.
Don't say, my vote doesn't count.
Mm-hmm.
It's important that we study the issues. We watch not just one news channel, but more than one to get both sides of a story, both sides of a candidate, and decide how we want our country and our state to be run. And so everyone who's listening, I expect you to get out and vote in the next election.
And don't complain if you don't vote.
That's right. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, so that is the end of our presentation. We've left about 10 minutes to answer questions, if there are any. And I will close down the PowerPoint.
We have several. I'm going to start at the first one I saw a while ago. Let's see. Very good, by the way. How about this?
Dr. Jones has a marker in Glendale on Route 2 at the north end of town. Did she live in that town as well? Yes, she lived in Glendale, and she was known in particular for her beautiful gardens there. Now, I was unable to find the actual street address from where she lived.
Okay. We have comments too, so I'm sort of sorting through the questions first.
So you can see who wins the prize. Huh?
Right.
Can I win?
Is any of this history taught in schools? It's empowering. Plus, you can see how bizarre things were, what change was occurring, and you can see the time span, which took a while before things did change. Yeah, I don't know if this is currently taught in school. I can't answer that. And you've probably heard me say that I disliked history when I was in school. And so if it was taught at that point, I doubt that I would have remembered it anyway. But yes, it's inspiring. And not only were these women involved in this movement, but so many of them were involved in a variety of other things as well. It's very inspiring to read about them and the work that they did. They put a lot of time and effort into the suffrage movement and stuck with it. So it began here in Wheeling in 1895, and the passage of the amendment didn't occur until 25 years later. And many of the same women were involved from the beginning to the end.
Okay, here's another question from Linda.
Did the Wheats remain married after the Campbell scandal? Yes, they did. Campbell did not. As I said, he filed for divorce the next morning and was divorced from his wife. But the Wheats did remain married. They are buried side by side at Greenwood.
Here's a question from Bonnie.
Hi, Bonnie. One of the Block brothers with a Bethany student. Oh, how about that? And a classmate of my grandfather. Was that Jesse? Was that the other college?
No, that was not. It was a college, and I'm sorry, I forget where it was, but it was in New England. I mean, what it was, the name of the college.
Okay. Why did Australia beat the Americans on the achievement of suffrage on a national level? Several different countries beat the United States, and it appeared in the United States that the Western states enjoyed women's suffrage sooner than the Eastern ones because they became states at a time when the efforts were more recognized. And I think of countries like Australia as being newer, and so they did not have the ingrained rules that we had from the time our country was founded. So good for Australia.
There was a huge movement in England. There was a lot of movement in England, and there was a great deal of support from women who worked in factories and a lot of marches. And we didn't talk about that as much here as women factory workers, but it was very, very big there.
Okay, here's a question from Carol.
Hi, Carol. What was the voting age? 21. That was just reduced, well, in my memory, was reduced to 18. So the voting age was 21 at that time.
In one of the later amendments in the 60s, I believe. Let's see. Barb?
The Intelligencer ran the 8-page special section about the women's suffrage movement and encouraged them to vote. Did the News Register follow suit, or were there arguments against it? I did not find anything in the News Register. So apparently this was just an Intelligencer supplement. And when I looked for anti-suffrage articles, it seemed to be split evenly. So it wasn't that one paper was on one side and one on the other, as far as I could tell.
Okay. Now I'm going to share some of the comments so you can read them, and if you have something to say. First of all, I think this from Sarah. And I think she meant to type condemned and probably an autocorrect thing.
Yes, absolutely. Women are held to a higher standard, I believe, and I think there is still discrimination.
Yes.
Not as much as racial discrimination, but certainly there is a certain amount of discrimination. I personally have never really felt a great deal of discrimination due to my gender. I was a math major, and so there were times when I was definitely in the minority in math classes in college. In fact, there was one case I was in differential equations. I was the only female in the class.
I can understand that.
But no, nobody gave me a hard time. And my own family, I mean, I had a ball glove and I had a fishing rod, and just like my brother did. So nobody really ever told me I couldn't do anything because I was a girl. But I know that occurs at least subliminally.
I felt in one of the places that I worked that I was discriminated against because I was a woman. I was actually asked to do the job of a man, but was not paid any different.
Yes, yeah, right.
I was doing his job while he watched the Eagles play, but
Yeah.
but I did his job and he made a great deal of money.
Yeah.
And here's a related comment, which of course.
The standard of pay, always plagued women.
Definitely.
Absolutely.
Still does.
Yeah.
Let's see here.
Marie Claire, there was an article in Marie Claire that I ran across on the internet that it showed that some of the discrimination that is still going on today, even in today's world. And it was kind of an interesting article showing what was discriminated in the early times and what's still discriminated today. And we didn't have time to go into that, but it's
the really horrible thing, in my opinion, was the mental institution thing.
Oh gosh.
Divorce was not, looked upon very highly, but a man could say that his wife was mentally ill and lock her away at Weston, and she was stuck there. And if you go to visit the asylum there,
it's terrible.
They have a list of some of the reasons that women were committed there, and things like she read novels.
Yes. Really, really horrible ways that they could put the woman in.
Yeah. And she had no recourse.
No.
None whatsoever. Okay, were there editorial opinions, I wonder, in our local paper? I admit I did not look on the editorial page, so that's something to go back and look at. I was more interested in the actual articles and the quotes and the names of the people, the local people who were involved. So that's something to look forward to.
Here's a comment from Linda about Mrs. Folks.
Folks had a niece who was married to a Viscount. Wow. The Viscountess, swathed in furs and diamonds, always accompanied her to Christmas Eve services at St. Matthew's. Wow, that is cool.
Oh my.
It's amazing. We've never heard of this woman before.
No.
This is why I like to do these history research things.
I know.
We find these really interesting people. And as you said, a lot of them are at Greenwood. And so
I want to know that, because when we do a Greenwood tour, I would like to know more about her and would like to know where you found that information.
Maybe you'd be Mrs. Folks.
I'd like to be Mrs. Folks.
All
so
right.
Show me where you found that information.
There you go.
Please.
Okay. All right.
There's another from a related question from Barb.
Who was the editor and publisher? Oh, golly, Barb, you keep asking these. I don't know. I don't know. As I say, I did not look at the editorial page, so I'll have to go back and look.
Barb has stumped the panel.
Stumped the panel.
Stumped the panel.
Here's Bonnie again, and then I think we have one more after that.
When I returned to West Virginia in 1980, if a man's wife died, he could legally declare her estate at $50, no matter what it actually was. Oh, okay. All right. Then he probably didn't have to pay taxes on very much. Yeah, it's interesting. The single women were able to do more than the married women. It seemed like
Yes.
they had a little bit more freedom, but of course, a divorced woman had nothing. A divorced woman could not have custody of the children, for example, just automatically.
Oh, a reply from Linda, so I'll put that up.
Okay, I know from having seen the Viscountess with her aunt. Oh, wow. I bet that was.
Oh, it's Linda. I'll be calling you, Linda. Wow.
And our last question is from Jen.
Again, one of the earlier speakers talked about how the more agricultural areas reflected more equality. Do you think that's part of the reason why the Western states were more homesteading areas gave women the right? Yes. I think women were involved much more in being the breadwinners, not that they got a salary necessarily, but they were out in the fields working. And I think their value was seen as more. And that could be why the Western states adopted women's suffrage sooner. Good point.
Very good. Jeanne and Judi, thank you very much. Before we go, we're going to draw for winner.
Do we get to draw?
Well, you can pretend, yeah.
Okay.
Trust me.
If we were at the library, you would let us do that.
Yeah. This is for next week, which is Ida B. Wells, one of my heroes. So I wish I could win that, but I can't win that. So that'll be next week. A lot of people saying thank you, so be sure to look at the comments when you're done.
Okay.
And here's what we're drawing for first. Votes for Women bag. And I have all the names here, so go ahead and draw.
Okay,
where do we draw?
Okay, Judy's drawing.
I'm trying to draw. Yeah, there we go.
Pam Iwuziak.
All right, Pam, good for you.
Patron. I'm so glad that she won.
And what was it that she won?
Yeah, she won the Votes for Women. This one.
Really nice.
Oh,
Very
good. Nice. She could put chocolate in there, huh, Pam?
Uh-oh. Here we go. Pick another one.
I'm pulling that one out.
All right, here it is. This is for the Heinz History Center tickets.
I won those last time.
You did?
I did. I have 2 tickets.
Sarah. We didn't actually put Sarah's comments, but they're pretty long, but make sure you read them because they were quite insightful. But Sarah, I think you won 2. You've won 2 more. So you can take 4 people.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Sean. We really appreciate the opportunity to do this.
We enjoy it. You do a great job, Sean.
Thank you. And join us next week for Anne Marie, who's great, and we'll talk about the Equal Rights Amendment. Thanks to everyone who participated, and we'll see you at Lunch with Books, and we'll see you next week. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.